Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire, coming to you from narco territory, as I like to say, Morelia, Michoacan, at the People's Reset, Derek Brose's People's Reset, which just wrapped up. I'm here with one of the speakers, Sterlin Lujan, crypto anarchist, also author of Dignity and Decency, Rhapsodic Musings of a Modern Anarchist. How are you doing, Sterling?
Yeah, brother, doing well. Really happy to be here. It's fantastic. Life is good. Can't complain.
How have you enjoyed the event?
Yeah, the event's been great. You know, I've been friends with Derek for a long time. I've spoken at a lot of his events over the years, and just this event, I think we've seen that it's grown. There's more people. There's more interest in parallel societies, in intentional communities. I think it's amazing. So,
I think you're also one of the sponsors, no?
Yeah, that's correct. The organization that I work with, we sponsored it. Yep. Second year.
Logos, yeah?
Logos, correct.
Yeah, and this is my third year. I almost wasn't going to come, and I'm glad I came. And it's just like every year it gets better.
I agree.
The event. And so people know that I focus a lot on world government, technocracy, geopolitics, stuff like that. And you're a tech guy, and maybe to start out, I always plant the big picture, and then we can go on any tangent you like. But just your sort of thoughts. Some people touch on that at the conference, Aaron Day and others. How do you sort of see, from your vantage point, the threat that's before us? World government, they're integrating the systems, World Economic Forum, UN, Bilderberg meetings. I was just reading these European elites have just been meeting right now, von der Leyen, with the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde. And, there's a great account I follow on X where he points out that all of these folks have attended Bilderberg, right? And so they're just centralizing power. And then we have the digital technocracy, the digital dictatorship that's coming in. We've got potential wars popping off, and neo-feudalism, right? They're attacking the middle class. And so just your thoughts on the big picture here.
Yeah, I think out of the gate, we certainly have a lot of room for concern, right? You have Agenda 2030, the World Economic Forum, Bilderbergs. You have these groups who are trying to consolidate power, and you kind of see this move to technocracy in the United States as well, with Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, all these guys getting together with Trump and being actually part of the government, Elon more directly than people like Peter Thiel. So, and certainly this doesn't look good, because it looks like this is a move towards specifically what we refer to as fascism as well, corporatocracy. So trying to push back against that is going to be vital. But I think there's other things that are happening as a result of this. There's a preliminary thing I want to say. So we talk about these ideas and we see how awful the world has gotten in a lot of ways, how downhill it's went. But I think it's also, as a result of that, it's very easy to be black-pilled. Right, it's very easy to see this encroaching slavery system, this predator class, as John Bush likes to call it. And so I hope that we can actually wake people up to the idea that there's actually going to be hope, and there's actually going to be change in ways that we can push forward and create newer societies. Now, before we're going to get into that, but I do want to talk a little bit about the status quo from another perspective, and that it does play into this idea of a black pill. So one of my favorite thinkers, a guy named John Vervaeke. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not.
Sounds familiar. But
yeah, he does a really amazing YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So what he said is that we're embedded in this massive crisis of meaning, and the reason this is relevant is because largely it has to do with broken and corrupt systems, technocratic systems, and the thesis behind that is a lot of people they feel isolated, they feel alienated, they feel like there's nothing they can do to salvage and save themselves. Vervaeke would say there's higher rates of suicidality, some of the highest rates of depression, there's addictions to different kinds of technologies, all of this stuff that's really, it feels like it's a sweeping move toward meaninglessness and nihilism. So that's a part of this technocratic move. So trying to help people also wake up out of this meaning crisis is key. So that's why I like to preface everything that I say, with the idea that it's not just the fact that we're in a slave system, but the slave system has these effects that are like ripple effects that are deeply entrenched in our psychology, and that makes things seemingly worse and worse. So that's why it's important we can start thinking about ways to escape this. And of course we can get into, I don't know where we want to start, but I will say this. The hope is not in being embedded in politics, right? I think everyone wants to try to work within the system, and working within the system means in a lot of people's heads going left or going right, but they don't really realize that this is a uniparty, and so much glucose, so much time, so much human energy and capital is spent trying to get the right person elected and put into power. But that ultimately ends up backfiring. So this contributes to this feedback loop of the developing and encroaching technocracy, and then of the meaning crisis along with it. So we have to, the only way to solve this is to exit these systems. And I want to talk a little bit about a book where a lot of these ideas came from that people don't mention. So a German economist by the name of Albert O. Hirschman wrote a book called Voice, Exit, and Loyalty, a decline in firms and states. So his idea was that typically within these systems, people first, if they enjoy that system, they're loyal to it. They give it their loyalty. They're part of it. And there are still people who are loyal to the system, but they're largely people who are corrupted, right? Or just people who are completely indoctrinated to it, right? The next step, and this is what you see a lot of people doing, is they use their voice to try to change the system, right? And that could mean protest, that could mean just speaking out, using their voice, but now we're seeing a lot of censorship. We're also seeing states and governments crack down on protesters. So that's those two steps. And of course what Hirschman envisioned, the pinnacle of pushing back against these systems and changing the world, was to exit those systems. So if you want to break down a corrupt system economically, you leave those systems and you start building ones that make more sense, that have people that align with your values, that share ideology, that share a spiritual ethos, and that are deeply attuned to one another. If you don't have that, then your community has a tendency to break apart. So this is this idea of voice, exit, and loyalty. Exit being what we're all trying to do, what Derek's trying to do, what most of the people at the conference here are trying to do as well.
Would the Amish be a perfect example of that?
That would be one example of a parallel society, right? That's kind of existing within a society, but kind of has their own rules. Yep. I think we would want to move beyond that, where we can be as separate, where we can separate community from state, right? We want to exit completely the state, not have to worry about dealing with their rules at all. Of course, that's a gradual or a stepwise process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight or just emerge creatio ex nihilo out of nothing, right?
And speaking along these lines, I'm fascinated by this topic. I haven't talked much about it in the podcast. Network states, which you talk about. You said you went to in your People's Reset talk, which is linked in the description. You talked about how you went to Balaji's event. I've downloaded the PDF of his book, which you said is available for free. I've had it on my computer for a while. I haven't had time to read it yet, but I think this plays into the part of some of the goals of the technocrats. This idea of network states, and so if you could just maybe go off on that tangent and how you see it playing into this, as well as I think you said maybe there are some good things.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of good things. I want to be very clear about this, because I want to agree with you and say this could play into the hands of the technocrats, really could. Now, I think to start this conversation off, maybe I'd define a network state and a parallel society so that we have a starting point. So I'll give you Balaji's definition first. Okay, so his idea in the network state, thenetworkstate.com is where the book is. He said that a value-aligned group of people, typically this is like a crypto community or a tech bro culture, but it could be anybody, theoretically. They come together, right? They have a mutual understanding, they share those values we talked about, and then eventually they might want to beam their community down to the land somewhere and create a physical infrastructure, right? Or build out wherever those places are. And so Balaji put his money where his mouth is. He set up his community in Malaysia, in Forest City. Forest City is a whole discussion. We'll get into that. It's a rabbit hole. But that's where he set up. And he had the first cohort, which was kind of like a pop-up city, and I was invited to that, and I went there. We'll get into a bit more of that experience in a minute, but for the sake of time, let's focus on this. Okay, so he actually just announced that he's having his second pop-up starting in March. They actually just reached out to me and asked me to come and be part of it. Don't know if I'm going to do that, because I will mention this now, that I think Balaji did a lot of things right, but I think he did a lot of things wrong. And I think that we can potentially do it better. Now,
just to clarify, these pop-ups, so are they events, or some people that go there, they live there?
Yeah, they actually, so this is his thought is that it would start as a pop-up, right, with a few people, because there's got to be a lot of infrastructure built. He couldn't just bring the thousands of followers, or actually he has like 1 million plus followers. He could bring all those people in at once. It wouldn't be feasible because he can't build it out that fast. So he's doing it like in a stepwise process where it's a pop-up for 3 months, and then takes a break, builds out more, pop-up. You see the thing. So this is a point I want to make. So he's doing his thing. There are people who want to be involved in those kind of communities that share his values. This is the point, and they can do that, right? But this is where I very strongly disagree with Balaji. In his definition of a network state, he would want to eventually gain diplomatic recognition, like with the United Nations, and play at the big boys table and eat the scraps of the masters. And I would disagree with that, and also a lot of people in the space would disagree with it. And this is where we can diverge from this technocratic sort of mindset, right? Because you can see where that could lead to technocracy and end up being a bad thing, potentially. Not saying that that's what he's trying to do, but we see where that could go. Okay. This idea, and this is extremely important, this idea of network states and parallel societies was not, Balaji didn't initiate these ideas. A lot of people hear the term, and that's where it comes from. That's it. In his book, he did not talk about the actual origins of this idea. It came from the crypto-anarchists and the cypherpunks. Timothy May, the godfather of crypto-anarchism, who was highly influenced by people like Murray Rothbard, anarcho-capitalists. He was even influenced by Ayn Rand to a degree. And he wrote a piece in 1992 called Libertaria in Cyberspace. And this was really the first piece that was written about this idea of having a self-sovereign networks in cyberspace with value-aligned people that are like evolutionary, and they're self-selective, meaning they can move around and they're adaptable. But he also, an important point, he said these communities would be protected by strong encryption protocols, have high anonymity, be insulated and impervious to attacks from outside nefarious actors like nation states and governments, and build out and be anti-fragile over time. He never mentioned the idea of beaming those communities down on land. He envisioned this as like a digital cyberspace mental territory, right? We're different. And he was one of the first people to think about the idea of maybe digitized tokens, being able to create different kinds of commerce in cyberspace. He wrote about this in the Anarchist Manifesto, Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. So that is the origin of the idea. And there are people in this space, like what we're doing at Logos, what Amir Taki's doing at DarkFi, that are trying to create the infrastructure and the tools to build network states. We sometimes, as an homage to the cypherpunks, call it a cyberstate. Cyberstate, or a parallel society, DarkFi uses the term autonomous political formation to promote these ideas rather than an idea of creating just another version of a nation state that may share values, right? So this is key. This is how we attempt to move away from the technocratic regimes. This is how we create a myriad of communities with value-aligned people. Of course, there's a lot more to discuss about how we prevent those communities from going corrupt and turning into the same things that we're trying to push back against. And we can get in, there's a lot to talk about there as well. But
last year at Anarchapulco, I met Vid Jedlička of Liberland.
Yeah.
Would you say what he's doing is an example of something like this? Or?
Yeah, maybe this is a good point too. We can talk about like what Derek's doing with Conscious Agora and these ideas of intentional communities. So let's differentiate all this stuff. So typically the key defining factor, and this also differentiates Liberland to a degree, the key defining factor is most network states and digital parallel societies start with large communities online first. And most of these communities right now consist of crypto people who have the capital and the resources to build these communities out, and they see them as being extremely large, whereas something like a intentional community is not always started online first. A lot of times they already exist on the ground in a physical community, and then they grow out. That doesn't mean they can not merge at some point. That could happen. Liberland is more of like a mixture of things, right? It's like has the traditional or legacy model of kind of a nation state where you have the physical territory first and you have a president and all the, so it's a bit different of a model that uses some traditional pieces but still has people in the cloud that try to come to it. So it depends on how it gets dicey and messy because it depends on how you define parallel society or network state. And of course, it's good to repeat this. I define it as that highly value-aligned community that meets online first and then beams themselves to the ground potentially. They don't have to do that, though. That's key. And they usually have some type of governance apparatus, some rule-making or sense-making apparatus as well, and that some technology facilitates that. It could be high-tech or low-tech. Like it could be a decentralized autonomous organization, or it could be a pad and paper with a charter and a constitution. So.
Do you see, in general, humanity sort of moving in this direction? Because, what you just differentiated, there's cyberstate or network state, where the good folks are involved in. And then I see the trend of technocracy. You've got the 1930s movement. Algocracy as well. I've read the papers by Nick Bostrom, who, when COVID began in March 2020, I was on record. I was a guest on Spiro Skouras' channel where I specifically said, the corona crisis the goal was to bring in a worldwide algocracy. And that's what Bostrom writes. He said, we need a world government based on surveillance and having AI governance. Joe Rogan with Mark Andreessen recently was saying, we could, why not have AI run the show? So I kind of feel like this is going to be the continuing trend of governments around the world, maybe trying to get rid of politicians, implementing algorithms, algocracy, that in a negative way. Do you see the trend overall of humanity sort of moving towards cyber or network states, or what you just described, these cyber or network states? Do you think this is just going to be some folks working on in parallel societies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's actually that. By the way, that is a good concern, and I hadn't heard that term before. I'm familiar with Nick Bostrom's work, but not that algocracy. That's good. That's a definite fear. But I do see, and we'll get to that in a minute, and the solutions to it. But yes, on a large scale, this is the direction that we're moving. This is a huge deal. It's not small. Let me give just a few examples. So there's a network state called Praxis.nation. They just got a $520 million capital injection into their ecosystem. They're mostly digital right now, but they're scoping out a few territories to build in. And one thing I didn't mention earlier that's relevant and apropos to the discussion is that most of these network state communities, they are leveraging things like special economic zones, special financial zones.
Prospera.
Yeah, that's right. Prospera is like a ZA. So, and just for anybody who doesn't know, to clarify, special economic zones are pieces of land that governments have set up to give special privileges and a degree of sovereignty to communities and to businesses that want to come in and build out in those particular areas. And just for example, outside of Dubai, there's multiple special economic zones that are set up for this. And a lot of times people leverage these to do business that would be onerous to do in other countries around the world, right? And so some things that are illegal somewhere that you can't do in that territory, like in the US, maybe you could do like a cannabis business or something. Maybe you could come over to one of these special economic zones and do it. You see, that's the purpose. And here's what's interesting about this. A lot of these network states are cropping up physically in these territories, these special economic zones, and these host governments are giving them a lot of free rein to do what they want because they believe it's going to benefit. It's like you see there's a mutual relationship there, mutual symbiotic relationship. And this is why this is happening. And for instance, like Prospera can do anything they want, and they can in terms of like their own legal code and laws, except as it concerns criminality or the criminal code of Honduras, right? So, and some are more free than others, but what's happening is these other countries don't want to be under the thumb. Like a lot of these third world countries, they don't want to be under the thumb of the fiat dollar and the hegemony of the Western world. So there's a sea change in the way a lot of these politicos that are outside the scope of the Western world are thinking about the U.S. And I'm sure, Trump with the tariffs that he just issued probably didn't help that situation. But the way that I see it is the more of these network states crop up in these physical environments all around the world, we're going to see a slow usurping of power from traditional nation states. And the reason that's going to happen is because we're going to be putting governance services on the market. We're going to be experimenting with different forms of governance with value-aligned people, as we mentioned in the definition. And what that means is over time, it forces, I use that word sort of figuratively, it forces governments to become market actors. Now, how this is going to play out over time and how much bloodshed and violence will result, I don't know. But I do know that these third world countries could end up being sort of subsumed under a network state as they grow, right? Or they could just end up being merging, because there is phenomenon over time where smaller like grassroots communities have grown up and kind of like become that ecosystem or that ecology of culture for a particular territorial region. I think Zomia, maybe in Southeastern Asia, is sort of like that. It's like a highland anarcho type of community. But this is how I see the future of these parallel societies ironing out. A little bit of this is my futuristic vision. We don't know exactly how it'll play out. But one thing is certain. This is happening right now. You saw the Praxis example. There's a myriad of these different communities all over the place. Balaji's is just one. Vitalik Buterin created a network state or a parallel society called Zuzalu. And Zuzalu has splintered off into a bunch of different villages, like eco-villages called zoo villages. Some are eco, some are like hacker villages. They had their first one in Montenegro in Europe. They had another one in Georgia that's specifically cypherpunk built around. And there's one starting in Africa. These were only meant to be pop-up cities, but now these guys are starting to think, we want to be here permanently. So we talk a lot about philosophy and we do a lot of futurism, but this is happening in reality right now. You can actually, and I'll give you, for your viewers, I have a QR code with a spreadsheet that has all the discords and questionnaires and stuff. You can go into these communities, get online, digital first, get to know them, and then if you wanted to go to these places, you can. And I always make the point that this is still the early stages, but even now, this isn't just billionaires hobnobbing on an island, taking MDMA, dancing and doing rituals under the full moon. That's not what this is about. I went to the network school. Balaji, and credit where credit is due, he kept the barrier to entry very low. I think I had to obviously pay my ticket to get to Malaysia, which is something. For some people, that's maybe a barrier to entry. But it was just $2,000 a month. And that's it. And we had to pay for food, of course, but that was basically just the hotel. And remember, this is on an island in Malaysia. That's relatively inexpensive. So all kinds of different people came. It wasn't just crypto bros. Again, credit where credit is due. That was a good thing. He had people who were like documentary filmmakers, a lot of creative types, artists. People had never even messed with crypto. And so there was all this intermingling of a community, and that was a good. So this is happening. This is real, and this is going to continue to grow. Investors are interested in putting money into this. Even the crypto ecosystem, there's a lot of people talking about public goods funding, using things like Gitcoin and other projects to rapidly fund these communities so that they can build outward digitally and physically.
And I've seen in the U.S. in different states, I think as well, like in Honduras, the Prospera type projects also beginning to pop up in different states in the U.S. Where they're trying to create their own. I view them almost as kind of like city states in a way. No.
Yeah. That's a good way. So there's a couple. I actually on my list I'll give you. One of them is in Arizona, and Arizona is probably one of the better places to be in the U.S. It's called Cul-de-sac. It's like they call it a walkable city, because there's not very many walkable cities in the U.S. Like, say you're in Europe, or even here in Morelia, you can walk a lot of places, even more so in Europe. Everything's walkable. So they had this idea. It wasn't political. It was more like, okay, we're going to have a more efficient city that's walkable. But this is a version of a network state. They started online. By the way, another term for this, these communities or these pop-up cities or network states that have a specific goal have also been called startup societies. There's actually a Startup Society Foundation that exists out there. And usually a Startup Society Foundation has a specific goal that's entrepreneurial rather than political in nature, where they want to improve something. So that is a phenomenon in the space, and Cul-de-sac is one of them. There's also another one in California called Edge Lana, I think. And it is like a city that's off to the side on its own, that's like developed from the ground up. And I think they're meaning for it to be a long-term thing as well. So yeah, you're right. These are cropping up within territories and nations as well as in special economic zones. Good point.
And I'm the way kind of you describe it, and the way I've been seeing it, it just seems like we're reaching a point of chaos. The nation state. Nicholas Berggruen, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's got an institute. He's talking about killing the nation state. We know the globalists have been trying to do that. I also argue that throughout human history, this is, part of it's an intentional process by actors. I think it's also kind of organic. I sometimes, I come from a biblical worldview where I also think even if, let's say, there weren't globalists, if we just let the humanity ball roll, we might eventually end up also in a similar place, because as things develop, economies develop, power, good or bad, centralizes, companies get bigger, things centralize, population grows, centralize, and you sort of do end up with a world government kind of by hook or by crook. Even if you left it alone, I could see that developing as well. I'm not in favor of world government, but I still like we're in this chaos. So you have nation states, you've got regional unions like EU, the trying to birth the North American Union. You've got the global governance structures already, the UNs and all that stuff. And now you've got these cyberstates, city-states. So it's kind of like factions fending for themselves. How do you see that playing out? Do you think dust will settle on some type of system, or is just going to continue these sort of factions trying to do what they...
Yeah, I can give you, this is a very futurism-oriented scenario, and I agree with you in the sense that if things were just kind of left to their own devices and there wasn't like black swan events and innovation in thought, like, yes, this is going to balloon out of control, and still could, right? And then a one world government control. I see your point in the sense that this is a fear, and we have to reckon with that fear and try to deal with it. But here's how I envision a future potentiality or a possibility. So all these network states are growing up, right, as I mentioned, and what we're doing as well, and this plays into this phenomenon, we're experimenting with various organizational and governance styles. So there's this mindset that in the past we have experimented, right? Or that democracy was this great, beautiful experiment. That's what everybody calls it. So we know that democracy was originally invented in ancient Athens, right? And then that caused some definite growth, right? But then it kind of went to sleep for a while. Different kinds of, basically a dark age appeared, and then democracy resurged and reemerged during the Enlightenment. When people were allegedly overthrowing the monarchies, they thought democracy was going to be this experiment in freedom, but it really wasn't an experiment. It was just copied and pasted everywhere else and just assumed almost in an ad hoc way that this was the best form of government. I said this during my talk, but H.L. Mencken, he famously said that democracy is the worship of jackals by jackasses, right? So we saw that democracy did not go anywhere, or at least it doesn't benefit us. Now the one world government fear. Let me get back to this point, though, of experimentation and how this benefits us. So if we're experimenting with different forms of governance all around the world, we have the opportunity to create a direction for the development and evolution of our societies. And how we do that is we can actually go into these network states, and we view them as petri dishes, and we can ingest quantitative and qualitative data, right? We can ingest all of this data, and we can optimize, right? And I know there's people, okay, this guy's a technocrat, he's thinking about like optimizing society on a fundamental level, but bear with me for a minute. So metrics right now that nation states use to show their growth, things like GDP, gross domestic product, those are all just beneficial for the elite, for the status quo, so for the power and the health of that economy. But what we can do now is we can look, the Kingdom of Bhutan has this measure called gross domestic happiness. So we can start measuring for what optimizes for collective betterment, for human flourishing, for anti-corruption, and we can ingest that good data, and then we can offer governance frameworks and menus to emergent and nascent parallel societies that set them on a path to success. I said this during my talk. I'm always reminded, when I think about this, I'm reminded of James Joyce, right, who wrote Finnegan's Wake and Ulysses. He said, history is a nightmare from which we are trying to escape. Well, this is this nightmare of governance and government being all these bloody revolutions, all of this corruption. It's like we're hurtling toward this self-destructive and self-cannibalizing process, which would be that one world technocratic government. But if we can optimize for what gives greater human freedom and flourishing and the ability to thrive, then we can actually change that dynamic and we can change that direction. And I believe right now we're in a bifurcation point. We're at a point in the historical arc where we can make conscious decisions to go that direction. But it does involve us escaping the status quo. It does involve more and more people getting involved in this movement and focusing on allowing the heterogeneous nature of humanity to shine through, the fact that we're all different, that we all have different values and thought processes. This goes back to the very definition of a network state, right? A group of people who share values. And this is another point. There will be some communities that probably don't optimize for ideas that we think benefit us. But if we start getting data on what works best and makes people happiness and what makes people happier, are they going to voluntarily go to all of these places where, you know, their kids, their children suffer, they suffer, dark-tried personalities are lifted to the top of the bunch? Probably not, right? The communities that flourish and that preserve our cultural heritage, our deep humanity, those are the cultures that are going to persevere and to live on. So I think this is a beautiful vision of the future, and I don't think we have to self-destruct. I don't think we have to go down the technocratic route. There are parts of this that could appear technocratic because they're technological in nature, but I think if we look at people's ideas like Terence McKenna, right, who really viewed the trajectory of history as us spiraling toward this like final eschaton, or this like spiritual development, this birthing crisis. I think that's what we're in right now, a birthing crisis, right? A butterfly about to erupt from the chrysalis. It's a change, right? Emergency has kind of two meanings. It's something that's urgent, that needs to be addressed right now, but it's also emergence, something that's coming out and changing. I think that's where we're at right now. And I know I'm saying a lot, this is very important stuff. There's another component of this that I want to talk about that's a little bit more down to earth. So one of the reasons why our current systems are mucked up, this is to your point about how things are just going like this. I'm going to provide the reasoning of why that's the case. We know that all these evil people get into positions of power. And we know that those systems corrupt, right? Frank Herbert's quote, it's not that absolute power corrupts absolutely, it's that absolute power is magnetic to the corruptible, right? What's going on here is that we have skewed incentives, right? Power automatically generates skewed incentives. These are zero-sum games. All of these political systems are zero-sum games because politicians, politicos, kleptocrats, they try to maximize their power at the expense of the collective, right? Their goal is to get the next office, to get the next namesake, to be the next king, right? To be the kingmaker. And what does that do? That creates arms races to the bottom, where they're all they want to do is protect themselves. So they look across the sea. They look at, like, in the US, they look at China. Oh, they're developing AGI as fast as they can, technocracy. They're developing drone swarms as fast as they can, technocracy. They're developing nuclear armaments as fast as they can, technocracy. Zero-sum game. So we have to be able to, and another term for this is like a Molochian dynamic, which just means that you're trying to optimize for local conditions at the expense of worldwide collective betterment. So that's another thing that our experiment with network states can do, is we can filter those zero-sum games and Molochian dynamics out of our systems. I think there's a brilliant amount of explanatory power in game theory for describing how we got to where we are today. And so I believe we have all this collective wisdom. We have this abundance of knowledge, not even in the scientific disciplines, but in religious traditions and spiritual traditions, that we finally have the opportunity to bring together and to deploy for our benefit as a species. So I think this is how I envision the future, and this is how I envision us not going down that technocratic route. We have to continue to experiment. We have to change the incentives. We have to fix the incentives, and that means fixing governance. And that puts us on a path to prosperity, to human abundance, not only material abundance, but spiritual abundance, and allows us to flourish.
Is there any, I have a love-hate relationship with technology. I got the laptops, the desktops, the cameras. I got a Starlink, if I ever go into boondocks and, need to broadcast from there, got the Starlink and all that. But sometimes I romanticize, I'm going to go visit again this year, I believe, my grandparents' village, which is in the middle of nowhere in Croatia, and I love being in the analog world. And there are some people, I see the overall trend as you're describing, the technologization of everything, smartphones, you name it, everything in all countries, it's all being pushed forward, digital entry-exit systems, countries are just activating them. So you can't sort of fight that tide. Skynet is becoming self-aware. I like to joke, right? In the benign way right now, technology is just taking over. But there might still be people who want to go Amish, right? Who kind of want to live in the analog world without cyberstates, network states, smartphones, Starlinks, none of that. Do you think there's still going to be place for those kinds of parallel societies? Yeah,
I think, and this is a way that I've thought about this, you can have high-tech or you can have low-tech societies, right? So one of the ways, maybe I mentioned this earlier, and I've talked to a lot of people about this because it's a huge concern in this community. So the high-tech communities are like the crypto bros, people dreaming about a future of artificially enhanced humans, transhumanism, maybe artificial intelligence. That's one form of community, but there are certainly people who envision a low-tech community where everything is organized by pen and paper, right? By a charter, by a constitution, by living off the land, right? By having an intentional community. So I think those certainly can and will still exist, but I think this is a thing I think is beautiful. I think there's a purposeful reapproach and rethinking of those types of communities. Or it's an idea of getting back to it. McKenna called it an archaic revival, that we should find our way back to the Gaian mind, back to nature. So I think that there's a spiritual emphasis on that that's somehow embedded in our collective psyche for whatever reason. And so I think we're trying to reimagine that. It's all through these communities. Even a lot of the crypto people that I talk to, they're starting to think, man, I like crypto, but I also like nature. Well, yeah, that makes sense. We are part of nature, essentially. So I think these communities are still going to develop. They're still going to exist. I don't think there's any reason why an intentional community or a community that's based off, living off the land, having maybe a phrase that's been used sort of pejoratively, but is true, is like this anarcho-primitivist mindset. That's fine. There's no reason that can't exist. So my vision, and I think a lot of us in the network state space, envision building a more cosmopolitan society, a more heterogeneous and pluralistic community, because we all don't think the same. This is the argument I made against politics earlier, right? Politics are what divide us along these lines, and they create more uniform creatures out of us who don't have an open mind, and they're in what psychologist Charles Tart called consensus trance, right? So this ability to go into these different network states, parallel societies, allows you to explore your full humanness, to be awakened, to be thinking. And that to me means, or it must mean, that there are going to be a lot of people who want to come back to nature and who want to live in these type of communities and who don't want to be high tech. And so that's how I envision it, as a real possibility. But again, this goes back to your and my and all of our concerns. We have to make this decision, and we have to fight back technologically, sociologically, philosophically against these systems and the status quo. If we don't, we are literally going to self-destruct. But I do think the time is ripe. A lot more people are internalizing these ideas, and even Trump freeing Ross. Of all the bad things that happened, a good thing happened. That's not to defend the status quo. It's not to defend Trump, but it is to say that libertarian mindshare has infiltrated and seeped into the collective consciousness, at least to a small degree. That's not saying we're winning or it meets this, this grand end futurist vision that we all have, but that there is possibility and there is hope. One other thing I want to mention here, this is something that I've been in speculative fiction and science fiction. There's a lot of genre movements, and one of those movements is this idea called hope punk, where people are writing all of these novels. Science fiction has the capacity to be visionary and to see the future, and actually people have predicted things through science fiction. So this whole genre of hope punk has emerged, where people are writing about these futuristic scenarios that start off as seeming dystopias, and then they change into these seeming utopias. They metamorphose, and they become more beautiful, more brilliant, and they support humankind. And so hope punk is a reaction against what they call grim, dark realities, which is all this dystopianism. So just like thinking about that, thinking about how science fiction has functioned as a crystal ball, as a soothsaying apparatus, that's, I think, we can lean on some of these trends and changes to think about where we're going. Not saying that's going to happen, but it definitely puts that meme deeply into our consciousness to where we can hope to create that change.
I think of, was it the Jetsons sort of?
Yeah, that's
hope punk. And I think even in the 1950s, I go back, I think they had a lot of hope punk type science fiction projections in the culture and television and movies. Let me ask you then about, since you're the tech guy, the tech expert, the crypto. Where are we at? What's important for you when it comes to the whole crypto wars? The bit you hear talk about Monero, Zanos, and then you've got Bitcoin maxis, strategic reserves, Trump, Howard Lutnick, Tether, all this sort of stuff. What's sort of your pulse here? What's important for you here?
So I've talked a lot about, in the conversation of network states, parallel societies, the idea of cypherpunk and crypto anarchism. So the most important thing to me in terms of currency, cryptocurrency, is privacy, is anonymity, is being able to selectively reveal yourself in your transactions, or to go completely dark, right? What DarkFi called having a dark forest, right? Being able to transact freely without people intercepting or surveilling those transactions, going against what David Chaum said would be the dossier society, where the government keeps a record of every little transaction. That's already kind of happening scarily with things like blockchain forensics, chain analysis, cipher trace. So spreading and promoting and promulgating privacy enhancing technologies is my focus in terms of the currency transaction, and that's what I hope network states and parallel societies leverage as well, is privacy enhancing transactionality. Because if we don't have that kind of currency floating around, it's too easy to be targeted and attacked and assaulted. We've already seen, even not going into the worst cases, but there's been cases where people have used things like Tornado Cash to move money out of very totalitarian states. And those totalitarian states can see the flow of that money, and Russia is a good example of this, right? And so they could trace that and go after the people who are donating to resistance actors and stuff. So there's very humanitarian, civil rights leaning reasons why we must protect privacy enhancing, anonymity enhancing tech. So when you see governments like the U.S. is specifically notorious about this, going after privacy enhancing technology, we have to fight back against this. So that's why I'm a fan of things like Monero and Zano. I'm not here to shill, but I am here to shill privacy. I'm a privacy maximalist. I'm a cypherpunk maximalist. So that's the important thing. And anything also, like a side point, anything that can be actually used as cash. Right, the thing with the crypto wars, Bitcoin now this is a whole tangent, it's podcast in and of itself. Bitcoin is completely usurped by the powers that be. Roger Ver just wrote a book recently called Hijacking Bitcoin. Bitcoin has no privacy. It's become highly commercialized and institutionalized. On the surface, that's not a bad thing, but when people like Michael Saylor, who's the head of some MicroStrategy head, is saying that you don't have to be this crazy crypto anarchist and hold your money privately. Instead, siphon it put it into our institution, that's probably a red flag, and you want to be mindful that this type of institutionalization of a currency represents a clear hijacking. And so moving into privacy anonymity coins is, I think, our best refuge to get outside the scope of these systems.
I became a Tumista. So here, you saw the Tumins here in Mexico. There's this movement since 2010. I don't know if you can call it like an alternate currency, but it's just a way for people to exchange further outside the system. So if anyone sees me in person, you can donate some Tumins, send them my way. And after the talks, after this conference, I've been a bit reticent about, I accept, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and it's on my website. I forget the third one, but I think I'm gonna do Monero now. I'll look into that and participate more in this space. I've gotten more confidence to join that party, Monero, Zeno, and all that stuff. And it's an economy, and it's a way of, as they call it, the counter economy, participating in the counter economy. Anything else that we talk network states, crypto, anything else that's you think is important to get across?
Yeah, I think one thing I've been talking about a lot recently, we have this goes back to the tech, high tech versus low tech. So we have all the hardware, we have all the software, but a lot of times we don't have the humanware, right? So I think having those deep human connections, learning to cooperate with people and learning to organize, learning to empathize using things like nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg's work. A lot of people have talked about sociocracy at the event. So I think that's an important thing to discuss. Yeah, I think I can also shill my personal work if this is the time as well. So you can find my personal work where I talk about a lot of these ideas aside from the network state parallel societies in my book, Dignity and Decency. So you guys can find that on Amazon. If you don't want it on Amazon, you can find me on X at Sterlin Lujan and at logos.co. and an organization a nonprofit that I started called Polis Laboratories. It's polis-labs.com. But a lot of the ideas of connecting with humans is in my first book here, Dignity and Decency. I recommend picking that up. So,
All right, a lot to digest. Thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Yeah, man, really appreciate it, brother.
Thanks.